Susan.
Connie and Sharon aren't in here yet. Hope they didn't get lost.
Where are they sitting?
With my husband. They're not there, they're here. Here. They're not in here.
That's okay.
I hope they didn't leave.
Let's get going.
Okay. Good evening.
What's he saying?
Good evening. Good evening. And welcome to the 50th anniversary celebration of the Cleveland Jewish News.
We are not Bernstein and Woodward.
We are not Dustin Hoffman or Robert Redford.
And as you probably already gathered, we're not Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David either.
We are
Ken Hochman.
Susan Levine.
Our first job is to turn the podium over to Rabbi Rosie Heim, a CJN board member and rabbi at the Temple Tifereth Israel. She's also a dear friend and will present tonight's invocation.
I'll ask you to please rise. On joyous occasions for something long awaited, we recite the Shehechianu blessing. This blessing speaks to our thankfulness for three aspects of life. First, within the word Shehechianu itself is embedded the word for life, Chai. This blessing is an expression of our gratitude for life and the people who brought us into the world. On this day, O God, we invoke your blessing on all those who labor to bring our beloved Cleveland Jewish News to life, its professional leaders, its publisher, Kevin Adelstein, and its editors and writers, and all those who work tirelessly behind the words in print to give strength to this cherished publication. We ask your blessing also upon the lay leaders led by Mark Freemuth, who share their time and their talents to ensure the vitality of the paper. And we express to you, O God, our gratitude for the commitment of our chair people for this magnificent CJN 50th anniversary event, to Susan Levine and Ken Hochman. May all of them know blessings in their lives as they give life to the written record of our people. The second aspect of the blessing is Kiyamanu. It refers to being established and the sense of security we are given by those people who helped raise us up to the life we live today. For this, dear God, we express our gratitude for our founders who put forth the imperative of freedom of the press that has led journalists the world over to share the truths of the human experience. We ask your blessing on our special guests this evening, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, whose names have become synonymous with speaking truth to power. May their work continue to challenge corruption and inspire the leaders of tomorrow to be faithful stewards of democracy at its best. And lastly, this blessing acknowledges that we have arrived, Higianu. I'm sure, like me, you look forward to the arrival of the Cleveland Jewish News each Friday. For me, the paper with a warm cup of coffee is an essential element of my Shabbat experience. Turning the pages, I, like you, learn about the happenings of my people far and near. I rediscover my traditions and how to celebrate them with joy, and I experience the life cycle of my community from birth to death. So tonight we thank you, God, for the 50 years that we have enjoyed the weekly arrival of the CJN into our homes and places of business, and we ask your divine blessing that this community treasure may continue to go from strength to strength for another 50 years and so many more. Gathered here together on this night, dear God, we affirm our gratefulness to you for giving us life, for sustaining us, and for allowing us to reach this joyous time. Please join me in Shehechianu. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Amen. And Mazel Tov.
Thank you, Rosie.
We forgot that.
Everyone here tonight is a dignitary, but we want to give a special mention to the following governmental officials who are with us tonight. Please hold your applause until we are completed with our greeting. Ohio's U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown. Okay, they couldn't wait. Judge Dan Polster of the United States District Court for Northern Ohio. Stephen Dettelbach, United States Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio. Judge Cheryl Karner of the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. Ohio State Senator Armin Budish. And Beechwood's Mayor Merle Gordon.
Now you can applaud.
We also very much want to acknowledge the numerous congratulatory proclamations received, including one from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C. All of these will be found in your tribute book. For more than 2 years, Ken and I, we call ourselves a dynamic duo, have been working on tonight's event, and we are very delighted to say we are sold out and well on our way to a financial success.
We greatly appreciate all 49 of tonight's sponsors, whose names have been displayed on the video screens and are also listed in your tribute book. A special shout out goes to our major sponsors, Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel, Tamar and Milton Maltz, the Harry R. Horvitz family, the Julius and Lena Kramer Memorial Fund of our Jewish Federation, the Rainbow Building, the Ratner-Miller-Shafran families, the Wayne Foundation, and the Esther and Hyman Report Philanthropic Trust.
We, of course, want to thank all of you for attending tonight, providing the financial support that will sustain and maintain the Cleveland Jewish News Digital Archive, the searchable database containing every word of every edition since the paper's inception from October 1964. As president of the Cleveland Jewish News Foundation, I am so pleased to be able to say that by the end of 2014, the foundation will not only have completed the digitization of all 50 years of the Cleveland Jewish News, but will also have completed 75 years of the Cleveland Jewish News predecessor newspapers. The Jewish Independent, established in 1906, the Jewish Review and Observer, which had its roots in the Hebrew Observer, founded in 1889, and the Yiddish Welt, or the Jewish World, the Yiddish language newspaper, from 1908 to 1950. With this accomplished, the Cleveland Jewish News Foundation will be the proud protector of 125 years of history of all the newspapers of record for the Northern Ohio Jewish community. Finally, but no less special thanks go to the host and volunteer committees, which are listed on page 7 of the tribute book, the entire CJN staff who have worked tirelessly on this event. And while this event is definitely not part of their job description, event planning is definitely something which the CJN excels. And one last thank you To the terrific volunteer ushers from the School of Communication at Cleveland State University who are studying journalism and political communication.
There are, of course, important housekeeping matters that must be addressed tonight. First, no flash photos can be taken, even of Susan and me. Second, no recordings can be made. Third, our speakers have graciously agreed to accept a few written questions from the audience. If you wish to offer a question, please do so by 8:45. Use the Maltz Museum's pen at your place and write your question on the note cards at your table. Quietly raise your hand so that an usher can retrieve your written question. And finally, Messrs. Woodward and Bernstein did not have cell phones in 1972. It was probably pay phones and rotary dialed ones at that. If they had cell phones, they would have silenced them during their interviews. Please extend the same courtesy to them this evening and silence your phones.
And lastly, our final honor tonight is to introduce Mark Freemuth, President of the Cleveland Jewish News Board, who has ably guided the CJN for the past several years. The CJN bylaws indicate that the newspaper is committed to the purposes and continuity of Jewish life and to the democratic traditions that have made our country a blessed land. Mark certainly embodies these values. So let us please welcome Mark Freemuth.
Shalom Haverim. Good evening. My name is Mark Freemuth, and I have the privilege of serving as the president of the Cleveland Jewish Publication Company, the proud publisher of the Cleveland Jewish News. Thank you all for joining us tonight and for your continued support of the CJN. We've heard Ken and Susan express well-deserved appreciation to many who have made significant contributions to this celebration. All of these folks are duly acknowledged and recognized in our tribute books and some in our slide presentation. But the three people who have devoted by far the most time, energy, and effort over the last well more than 18 months are our publisher, our indefatigable publisher, Kevin Adelstein, and our outstanding co-chairs, who you've just heard from, Susan Levine and Ken Hockman. Susan and Ken have spearheaded and shepherded the conceptualization, planning, and implementation of this entire event. Their leadership, focus, and influence has extended to every aspect of the process, from the 50,000-foot level down to the most minute detail, including the color of the icing on your cupcakes. While we can't adequately thank them for their dedication and tireless efforts, we would like to present each of them with a golden anniversary token of our appreciation. I'm going to take this opportunity to also ask the entire CJN staff to rise, please. As you've heard from Ken and Susan, they have devoted, they have gone well above and beyond their normal call of duty. Some might even call it hazardous duty for this event. These are the people that make the trains run on time. And you should know who they are, and they are definitely deserving of our appreciation and thanks. So, Manish Tana, why are we here tonight? We are here, of course, to be educated and to learn from the perspectives of our esteemed award-winning journalists and authors, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. And of course, we are here to celebrate both the history and the future of the CJN, which is one of the very few independent, community-owned Jewish media organizations in the world, actually. And it has been published every Friday for the last 50 years. And I assure you, there is no intent to change that paradigm. And we are here to preserve and protect and enhance the CJN Digital Archive, as you've heard. Because of your generosity and support, the archive will be expanded to include the 3 predecessor Jewish newspapers, and this archive will be the single most comprehensive resource of the history of this Jewish community back to before 1900. And there is one other reason. In good times and hard, this remarkable community comes together to support, to strengthen, to inspire, to achieve, and to celebrate. We recently rallied together in support of Israel during the Gaza conflict. And just a few days ago, we all came together to start yet another Federation campaign for Jewish needs, to support Jews in our community and well beyond our community who need that support. And here we are tonight, gathered together again, 900 strong, 900 strong, to recognize 50 years of CJN accomplishments and its value to our wonderful Jewish community. We are so pleased to be able to present this celebration to and for the entire community. As the rabbi said, may we go from strength to strength. At this time, we'd like to share with you a short video tribute to the CJN and its people. We wish you all and your families a happy, healthy, and peaceful Shana Tova. Thank you again for joining us tonight.
From the clatter of the press room to the silence of the PC, from the stylus of the scribe to the editor's delete key, from hot off the presses to up in the cloud, from ink to link, technology has shaped the nature of news delivery. But it has not affected the nature of the news itself. Though the messenger changes, the mission of the Cleveland Jewish News remains constant into the 21st century. To tell the tale of today's Jewish happenings, to give the stories depth and breadth, to keep the words of the Jewish people alive, locally, nationally, and internationally. The Cleveland Jewish News debuted in October 1964. That newspaper was markedly different from its predecessors, the Wertheimer family's 67-year-old Jewish Review and Observer, the 66-year-old Die Jüdische Welt, and the Weidenthal brothers' 47-year-old Jewish Independent. This new entity was owned by a much larger family, the entire Jewish community of Cleveland, and its board of directors, a group of 29 business, professional, and Jewish community leaders headed by Lloyd Schwenger, purchased the assets of the 2 existing papers for $155,000. The founders faced a dilemma. They wanted a Jewish newspaper that presented more than the rites of passage sections, but they didn't want a partisan paper. Yet they needed Federation support.
It became apparent that what was needed was an independent voice for the community, which was to be the future Cleveland Jewish News. This was going to be a real newspaper with an independent editorial policy, not a creature of the Federation. It's that way today, it's been that way for 50 years, and frankly, we're happy it is.
CJN was born on Payne Avenue in downtown Cleveland.
We needed a different kind of newspaper, a newspaper that would, above all, be independent, which it was from its first day and continues to be, and one that was more engaged in the overall Jewish community, which it continues to be.
Back in 1964, Arthur Wayne, a Philadelphia and Atlantic City Jewish news journalist, became the first editor with a modest editorial staff of 3. As the Jewish population moved eastward, the CJN followed. For 20 years, the newspaper flourished in a building at Cedar Center in University Heights. Jewish leaders, public figures, and dedicated readers would arrive for meetings, interviews, or delivery of interesting news items. And sometimes, nonagenarian Irving Stone showed up too.
Irving would schlep up those heart attack steps to the office, which was on the 2nd floor. And he would come in and I'd say, Irving, why are you schlepping up here? There's no meeting or anything. And he'd say, I came to pay my subscription, my yearly subscription. I said, well, why don't you mail it in? And he said to me with a straight face, I wanted to save the postage.
Of course, the real reason Irv came calling was his passion to see the progress of the paper, his baby, coming of age. For the next 13 years, the CJN did business on Warrensville Center Road in Shaker Heights, until the relocation in 2002 to the current site in Beechwood. But the beating heart of any newspaper is the people, the leaders.
And the leaders were people who were really giving. There was really no ego involved, and it wasn't about being the president of the CJN or the leader of the CJN. It was really about serving the community and serving it well, and having the right people in place and the right staff to do that over time. And I think the leadership was very successful in doing that.
Jerry Barish, the second editor who served for the next 10 years, oversaw reporting of 2 Israeli wars and the tragic, earth-shattering, life-changing Munich Olympics of 1972.
Cindy Dettelbach followed in Jerry's footsteps, although the idea of a female editor was almost as difficult for the board to accept as the new technologies. When Cindy first began as a freelance reporter, she wrote stories on manual typewriters. Even when she first became editor, non-local news was transmitted over a teletype that clacked incessantly, spitting out reams of barely legible copy. But oh, how times they were a-changing. And how much more Cindy contributed to the Cleveland Jewish News than a gender education and the electric typewriter. Those 30 years saw the advent of increasingly sophisticated technological tools, fax machines, computers, electronic transmission of data, and breaking news updates on the web. The paper continued to win increasing numbers of journalistic and artistic awards, both in the Jewish and general press, a phenomenon still ongoing. The editorial staff covered stories such as the denaturalization trials of John Demjanjuk spanning 3 decades, 2 intifadas, the Gulf War, numerous acts of terrorism, the stirring stories of brave refuseniks in the Soviet Union, Cleveland's remarkable role in their emigration, and the lifting of the Iron Curtain, the tragic fate of Judy Resnick and the Challenger spacecraft.
The 80s and 90s were a turning point for the publication as it continued to grow in financial stability. This period marks the addition of the magazines division, the publishing of J-Style, and special occasion supplements. CJN created the events division consisting of Maj tournaments, Simcha Paloozas, Mazel mixers, wedding and bar and bat mitzvah fairs. CJN developed its digital footprint with the first e-newsletter, now known as Boker Tov, and the ability to read CJN on multiple platforms. These innovations grew from specific goals established by the board.
We are grateful to the leadership and members of the boards and staff of the CJN and CJN Foundation over the past 50 years who have been true to the original mission of the CJN and created and enhanced a valuable community asset. And of course, to our loyal subscribers, advertisers, and supporters. We take pride in our past and have great confidence in our future.
In 2006, the board created the Cleveland Jewish News Foundation. Its purpose is to educate the community through programs and events, build for the future by supporting the CJN internship program, and preserve Jewish community history with an online archive. That archive launched in 2010 but lacked funding.
We are realizing our long wished-for dream to raise the necessary funds to enable the Cleveland Jewish News Archive, the single most comprehensive source of Northeast Ohio's Jewish community, to be able to preserve, protect, and present to everyone.
Anytime and any place. Each week, CJN is added to the archive, creating an ongoing and ever-expanding history.
I know firsthand how valuable the use of the archives are. The CJN archives are a really important resource in our community, to researchers, to academicians, and also to the public in general.
One of the challenges of CJN today is keeping a younger Jewish population engaged.
My experience at the CJN inspired me to move back home. As a board member, I'm so proud of our work to continue to expand the internship program, which has given dozens of young people a new way of looking at Jewish Cleveland and their role in its future.
Today's Jewish youth of the so-called millennial generation, the future of the Jewish community, is digital. Their purchasing decisions, points of view, and advocacy efforts rely on what they find online and on their phones. If the Cleveland Jewish News is to retain its readership, it must remain technologically relevant. That means taking risks. Hiring a Catholic columnist to create content for a Jewish newspaper. How much riskier does it get?
I met with Kevin Edelstein, and he said he wanted me to write for the Cleveland Jewish News. He thought it was a great match, and he used the word beshert, meant to be. And that's when a little light bulb went off, because my husband used that same word when he met me 22 years ago, that it was meant to be. So I think this partnership is meant to be.
Cleveland Jewish News' new president came on board in 2013 to innovate while respecting the esteemed traditions of the Cleveland Jewish News.
I grew up with this newspaper. This is the paper you read every week. And now, thanks to the digital universe, you read it every day. There are so many decisions that go into putting this paper together. Decisions that affect you as readers and us as operators of your community newspaper. We've stayed true to our roots dating back 50 years now. We want to achieve our goals and ensure for future generations that they'll be celebrating 50 years from now.
Vi Spivak, the eternally young maven of Jewish society, epitomizes the spirit of Cleveland Jewish News and is herself a walking archive of the past 50 years.
I am seeped with the beauty, the activity, the passion of Cleveland people. You know, I remember, I think one of the very first columns I wrote in March 1965, I wrote about Vic Gelb, who was a leader in the community, and Bill Gould, who was an artist. And guess what? I could write about them today.
I remember it well, Vi, and I think I'm the oldest living president of the Cleveland Jewish News.
For 50 years, the CJN has succeeded in fulfilling its founder's vision as a newspaper on which its readers can rely for local, national, and international Jewish news.
Technology is ensuring that we can access the Cleveland Jewish News today and in the future, anywhere, anytime, and any place, on any platform.
And that we will keep our words alive through the 21st century as we keep pace with technology that transforms the delivery of the minute-by-minute news.
But my favorite platform is still my old Smith Corona typewriter. So there.
What a great production that was. Steve Hacker, Norman Wayne, entire organization, thank you. We are so fortunate here in Cleveland, Ohio, to have a newspaper just like this. We've been here 44 years, and it gets better each and every year. My name is Milt Maltz, and my partner is sitting out here somewhere. There you are, Tamar. And we're the founders of the Jewish Heritage Museum. But in addition, thank you very much. In addition to that, I serve on the board of the Museum of the Jewish People, Beit Hatfusot. Aviv, Israel is undergoing a major renovation. How many of you have been there? It's in Tel Aviv. Raise your hands. Well, if you've enjoyed it then, you're going to be stunned about what is going to be seen there now. It's a major renovation with many new and exciting exhibits. One of these take you on a journey through the ages. I guess I don't have quite good light here, so perhaps they can do something about that. I don't know. One of these takes you on a journey through the ages of Jewish heroes in various categories, beginning with Moses and Maimonides. But I'm not going to take you all the way back, because I only have 3 minutes on this band. So let's fast forward and select a few heroes of the last 50 years. We'll take the first category. It's called world culture. Now remember, this has been designed mostly by Israelis. The hero is Steven Spielberg. And as you know, his sister was here just a couple of days ago as she produced Above and Beyond, the history of the Jewish or Israeli Air Force. He's considered the finest director in the motion picture industry, many Academy Awards, a gross exceeding $8.5 billion. Not bad for a little kid from Minneapolis. And believe it or not, our runner-up, and this is hard to believe because the Israelis you wouldn't think would understand what he's all about, the runner-up was Jerry Seinfeld. In the category of leadership, the Israeli Museum picked as its hero Cleveland's own Abba Hillel Silver for mobilizing support for the founding of Israel and influencing the United Nations to vote for creating a Jewish homeland. Now, there are 3 ties for heroes in the athletic grouping. The first one was Max Baer. Any of you remember him? The world heavyweight champion of 1934. And my father took me there to see him beat Max Schmeling, and I was only 5 years old. Tied along came Major League pitcher Sandy Koufax, the youngest player ever elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame. And of course, Mark Spitz, 9-time Olympic champion, considered the swiftest swimmer of all time. Then there was the class of inventors and scientists. And Beit Hatfusot presented Albert Einstein. In addition to developing the theory of relativity, he warned President Roosevelt that the Germans were accumulating uranium, the principal material used to create the atomic bomb. And he urged Roosevelt to act immediately, which of course we know led to the creation of the Manhattan Project. The next category they called courage. Hannah Zenes, poet, playwright, soldier. During World War II, she volunteered to parachute into Yugoslavia to assist in rescuing nearby Hungarian Jews. She was, as we all know, caught by the Nazis. Hannah, at 23 years of age, was tortured, yet she never revealed more than her name. And then, of course, we know she was executed. Under the category of journalism, and you know where I'm going with that, don't you? We will have on this stage shortly 2 men responsible for one of the greatest political upsets in American history, Richard Nixon's resignation as President of the United States. And this is a result of two very, very young cub reporters from the Washington Post, willing to take risks and believing in fundamental, solid journalist practice, which so often is missing in the current media environment. Their careers continue with numerous books, articles, and publications such as Time, The New Republic, The New Yorker, many national television appearances, and of course, the film based on their very first book, All the President's Men. So now, ladies and gentlemen, may I have the house lights up? On behalf of our Jewish News, on this 50th anniversary, and to those of us assembled in this room, I am honored to state that you, Carl Bernstein and Robert Woodward, you are our heroes tonight.
Let's hear it for Woodward and Bernstein. Good evening. My name is Kevin Adelstein, and I'm the publisher and CEO of the Cleveland Jewish Publication Company. Welcome this evening. It's so wonderful to see all of you here. Thank you for joining us for this wonderful simcha. For 50 years, the Cleveland Jewish Publication Company has maintained a reputation of being nonpartisan, with our newspaper, the Cleveland Jewish News in particular. This evening shall be no different. We'll carry that tradition on. So, without further ado, gentlemen, let's get on with the show. So, we're going to take a look at, Milt had a wonderful introduction a little bit ago. Beautiful introduction by Milt, and we're waiting on a photo to come up on the screen. Oh, there. I probably blew my cue there or something like that. Here we go. So we saw this a little while ago.
That's our bar mitzvah picture.
Carl, who are these guys?
That's our bar mitzvah. We're 28 and 29 years old in that picture. Maybe 30, 31, but it's early in the coverage of Watergate. We were metropolitan reporters at the Washington Post. I had, by that time, 12 years experience in the business. Woodward had a couple, but we were not part of the reportorial elite. And we covered this story of this break-in at the Watergate headquarters of the Democratic Party the way any good local reporters using common sense would go at it. We were kind of methodical. We were energetic. We tried to use common sense. And interestingly enough, the difference between those kids in that picture and the more senior reporters in Washington was that they made an assumption about the President of the United States that he and his people could not possibly have anything to do with this untoward event, such as this so-called third-rate burglary. And of course, what we eventually found out, and we know now 40 years later, that that third-rate burglary was the key to understanding a criminal president and a criminal presidency from the beginning of Richard Nixon's administration until he left office.
Okay, so we're not going to dodge Watergate here, obviously. Bob, you got the call at first, right? You were at home Saturday, so Saturday morning, one of your city editor woke you up, I believe. Take us down that path.
And it was one of the most beautiful days in Washington. And what happened, the editors had come in early, and they said, who would be dumb enough to come in and work today? And they immediately thought of me. And so I got called in to cover the arraignment of the 5 burglars, which was revealing in itself because the head burglar wouldn't say where he had worked when the judge asked him, and he kept, judge said, well, where did you work? And James McCord went, CIA. And the judge said, speak up. And so finally McCord, CIA. And I was in the first row and kind of gasped and said, holy shit. So you knew it was a big story. But one of the elements here, and Carl and I have lived the history of this and the discussion of it, and it applies to your independent newspaper and the importance of its independence. Our boss was Ben Bradley, the editor, who after Nixon he had resigned, and they were going to make a movie of all the president's men to describe how we reported this story. And they're sitting around, Alan Pakula, the director, and Redford and Hoffman, and they're saying, who are we going to get to play Bradley? And Redford had known Jason Robards quite well from working with him on Broadway, and said, well, Robards is a natural, and in fact, he's just like Bradley.
Really?
They were separated at birth. And so they called Robards in, and this is the middle 70s, and Robards was at the low point of his life. He'd had an accident, he had a drinking problem, and they said, we're going to give you $50,000 to play Ben Bradley. And so $50,000, great, took the script home, came back the next morning and said, I can't play Bradley. And they said, why? And he said, well, I read the script. And he said, yeah? And he said, well, all Bradley does is run around and say, where's the fucking story?
So,
sorry.
No, go,
I'm
please.
just quoting.
Please. I think they want to hear it. I think they want to hear this.
Okay. And they said to him, that's what the editor of the Washington Post does. And
repeatedly.
It's a simplification, but Bradley was our inspiration. Bradley was the one who said, look, we go where the facts lead us. Yes, we're not able to name our sources, but that's okay. We've triangulated here. We believe we're on solid ground. And the confidence that he had in us in this pursuit made it possible. Without Bradley, there's no Watergate story.
Did he or the owner, Catherine Graham, ever doubt you at any point during your reporting of this massive story?
There were times when Bradley, particularly, would say to us, and sometimes we would disagree violently with him, you don't have it yet. And we would say, and he'd say, you need another source. And I would say to Woodward, how many damn sources does he think we have? And we would go out and keep moving. But let's talk about Catherine Graham.
John Mitchell.
He wants to talk about Graham. You want to talk about Mitchell.
No, but they're related.
They are. First, I'm going to talk about Catherine Graham. That there came a time, because Bradley and Catherine Graham are really what made this work, that really were the backbone that enabled us to do what we were able to do. Here is this publisher at the Washington Post, and after a few weeks, when we start to make some real connections that the Nixon White House and his people have something to do with this break-in, I get a call at my desk from a guard downstairs that there's a subpoena server with a subpoena for our notes from the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon as president. And I say, keep that subpoena server out there on 15th Street downstairs. Don't let him up to the newsroom. I call Bradley. Bradley says, just a moment. I'm going to call Catherine. He calls upstairs to Catherine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post. He calls me back. Bradley, he says, Catherine says, get out of the newsroom. They're not your notes. They're her notes. And if anybody is going to go to jail, if anybody is going to be, say these sources are such that we will not reveal them, it's going to be her, and they're going to have to go after her.
And what was interesting, he said, can you imagine the picture of Katharine Graham's limousine going to the D.C. jail and her getting out
Our gal, as he said.
to protect the First Amendment? And he said it would be on the front page of every newspaper. And that's how solid she was.
Okay, so we're talking sources. I think everybody in this room that's familiar, obviously, with Watergate and sourcing, one infamous one, Bob, you had a very trusted relationship with a source who, Deep Throat, we later, you know, in the 80s, late 80s, found out to be Mark Felt. Accurate?
No, it was 2000.
2005. I'm sorry,
yeah,
2005.
Much later.
2005. Okay, so Mark Felt comes out and says, I'm Deep Throat. Let's talk about that relationship you had with Deep Throat, because this source, you tell us, how much did you have trust in him?
Well, he was number 2 in the FBI, and the FBI was conducting this investigation, which, as we now know, was not very good. But Felt had an animus, I believe, toward Nixon. He didn't like the way the Nixon White House was trying to control the FBI. And so he was willing to help us, but he, as Carl has said, he didn't deliver us a grocery cart of documents from the FBI. He was very cagey about it, and he insisted on very clandestine meetings to protect himself, to make sure that he was not identified. And it was, you know, almost 35 years later that he came out and identified himself. So it was, he was an important organizing source. He confirmed a lot of things, but if you look at the book, All the President's Men, you see it's going around, knocking on doors, getting details from people like the bookkeeper, from the Nixon campaign chief treasurer, Hugh Sloan. And so it was never one source on any story. And there were crucial points Mark Felt helped us, but we still would have written stories without him. It wouldn't have had the
us
authority.
A certainty that we were right. But let me pick up where you've left off about these sources. Because we found out very early that Richard Nixon's re-election committee, headed by the Attorney General, former Attorney General of the United States, and Nixon's former law partner, John Mitchell, had maintained a secret slush fund, more than $700,000, that had paid for the bugging at Watergate and other undercover activities against Nixon's political opposition. And we had come to learn this by knocking on a lot of doors at night, and particularly from one particular person who had been the bookkeeper, as Bob said, for Nixon's re-election committee. And she had started to reveal to us, and eventually we got to the treasurer and others, and we knew for sure that Mitchell controlled this fund. So we wrote this story, and Ben Bradley said to us, you know, there's never been a story like this, ever. You're about to say that the Attorney General of the United States is a crook.
And then he said, you better be right.
You better be right. So we went with the story, and as we always did, I called the White House that night to get a comment on the story, and an assistant press secretary said, the sources of the Washington Post are a fountain of misinformation. I said, is the story right? Did Mitchell control the fund? He said, the sources of the Washington Post are a fountain of misinformation. So I said, okay, I'm going to call Mr. Mitchell. I had a phone number for Mitchell in New York. I got him on the phone. I said, Mr. Mitchell, we've got a story in tomorrow's paper I'd like to read to you. Get your response. He said, okay. I got as far as John N. Mitchell, while Attorney General of the United States, controlled a secret fund. Mr. Mitchell said, Jesus. I got a few more words into the first paragraph. Controlled a secret fund that paid for the undercover operations. And Mr. Mitchell said, Jesus. And then I got to the end of the first paragraph, which is exactly as I've described it to you, by which time the drift of the story was unmistakable. And Mr. Mitchell said, Jesus Christ, all that crap if you print that, Katie Graham, referring to Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Post, is going to get her tit caught in a big fat ringer. And I kind of instinctively jumped back from the phone myself, worried about my own parts more than Mrs. Graham's at the moment. And then he said the most chilling words that I, as a journalist, have ever heard. Mind you, the Attorney General of the United States, the most powerful law enforcement officer in America, said, and when this campaign is over, we're going to do a little story on you two boys, and he hung the phone up. So what did he mean? What was that about?
Tell him, though, you called Bradley.
So then, exactly. So I called Ben Bradley at home.
We were always good at following the chain of command.
Yes. Yeah. So,
Bradley, 20 other editors, and us.
That's
and
it.
we would
That's
always
right.
go to
We're
Bradley.
team players. So we called Bradley, told him what Mitchell said. He said, he really said that? And I said, yeah. He said, you have good notes? I said, yeah, it's all right here. It's all typed out. He said, well, leave her tit out and put it in the paper.
So I think they can listen to your story.
And the next morning, Mrs. Graham came by my desk and said, well, Carl, do you have any more messages for me?
So that kind of ownership, that kind of support from your publisher, from your editor, with all that's going on in newsrooms today, we see it every day in our own market, we see it across the country, we see it across the world for that matter. Is that support still there for journalists that are trying to uncover a story like that?
There's some of it, but not enough. Let me tell this story real quickly in compressed form because it tells you about the nature of the support. In January '73, Katharine Graham invited me up for lunch. She'd supported us. We knew it, really didn't know her. Carl had to go to a funeral that day, so I represented us. And so I remember walking into the lunchroom, and she starts asking me questions about Watergate. And she really blew my mind with what she knew about Watergate. She had absorbed it all. Even at one point, she said she'd read something about Watergate in the Chicago Tribune. I remember thinking, what the hell is she reading the Chicago Tribune for? No one in Chicago does. That's a cheap shot. I'll take it. But she had this management style, which is critical, which is mind on, hands off. She didn't tell us how to report, the editors how to edit. But this moment, January '73, Nixon had won re-election 2 months earlier, won 49 states, beating George McGovern with the greatest electoral majority ever. The stories we had written, by and large, particularly among our colleagues at the Post, were not believed. And we later learned one of the secret strategies of the Nixon people was to get people to file challenges to the FCC licenses that the Post Company owned. So the journalistic credibility was in the toilet. The stock of the Washington Post Company had just gone public. It would, skyrocketed down. It was in the toilet. So the moment of maximum peril for the organization. And we're going through this, and she finally had the killer CEO question, which is, when are we going to find out the whole truth about Watergate? And I said, Carl and I had thought about this, to say the least, and because there was an organized, well-funded cover-up, that the Watergate burglars were being paid for their silence, because when we went to visit people without appointments at night, most of the time we got a slammed door in our face, and that the investigation conducted by the Justice Department was not rigorous, to say the least. So the answer, when are we going to find out the whole story, is never. Remember looking at her across the luncheon table, and she had this pained, wounded look on her face. And she said precisely, never, don't tell me never. I left the lunch a highly motivated employee. But the never, don't tell me never, was not a threat, and this is what's important. It was a statement of purpose. What she said is, look, we're in the newspaper business. This is what we do. We dig into things and use all your resources, Carl's resources, in fact, the resources of the whole paper to get to the bottom of this, because that is the job we signed up for. And she even said, because it involves the President of the United States, we have a triple, maybe a quadruple responsibility to get to the bottom of this. I remember leaving that lunch saying, wow, there is an owner, there is a publisher who understands the business we're in and is willing to take all the risks to our reputation and to the finances of the company to do what our assignment is. And your question, I think there's still a lot of that in the newspaper business, not enough of it.
Okay.
And not enough reporters who were sent out to dig and knock on doors, house calls.
We're going to talk about that, but let's go back to your relationship with Bradley was obviously unique. And in the movie, All the President's Men, one of the pivotal moments of the movie came in a quote that Bradley had given young Woodward and Bernstein, and I'm going to quote it, talking about the pressure that must have been going on behind closed doors when you guys were on the outside. We're under a lot of pressure, he said. Nothing's riding on this except the First Amendment to the Constitution, freedom of the press, and maybe the future of the country. So, pretty pivotal. What you guys, and in the movie, you guys are standing outside, Hoffman and Redford were standing outside Robards' apartment, saying this in his bathrobe, he's saying this to you guys. Take us down that road.
It's very good screenwriting. Those weren't quite his exact words, but they were the thought. And this was just before the Watergate hearings were to convene, and we had been told that the President of the United States was deeply involved in the cover-up, that it would be revealed how he was involved in it, that there were undercover illegal activities of this kind we now know from the tapes that began in the first days of his presidency, ordered by him, and that this was going to be a story that was going to shake the very foundations of the Republic.
And Mark Felt had said that the stakes are so high, lives could be in danger, and there's wiretapping going on everywhere. That's why we went to Bradley's house, again observing the chain of command, and called him and said, we have to talk to you, and then asked him to come out on the lawn, and he thought we'd finally gone off the rails.
Really?
Now, it's interesting what's in the movie, and Carl's right, it's good screenwriting, but we kept notes of all this stuff. And at first we thought what he had said is the stakes are so high that a very important part of our anatomy is on the chopping block.
That's exactly right.
It turned out that wasn't right. Hollywood's version was not right either. You know what he said to us? When we laid all of this on, he said, what the hell do we do now? And that's the right question, because it was a moment that had never occurred in journalism or in the country before.
And ever, any time during that series that you guys were doubting each other, doubting yourselves? You knew what you had.
I think that we knew how deeply the president was enmeshed in this, and that this criminality was basic to this presidency. And one of the interesting things is how early we knew that. At the time we had discovered this secret fund, which was about 8-9 weeks after the break-in at Watergate. Once we had found out that John Mitchell controlled that fund and some others, including the president's chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, we would meet in a vending machine room, Bob and I, off the newsroom floor every day to kind of get our ducks in a row to present to Bradley and the chain of command. good cop, bad cop routine. You can imagine who was the good cop and who was the bad cop. And the day that we were going to write that Mitchell story, I put a dime in the coffee machine, and I literally felt a chill go down my back, literally. And I turned to Woodward and I said, oh my God, this president is going to be impeached. And Woodward looked at me and he said, oh my God, you're right. And we can never use that word impeached around this newspaper or this newsroom ever, lest somebody here think we have some kind of an agenda, because we didn't. And that was the whole point of the reporting. You know, somewhere along the line, we picked up this idea, definition of what is good reporting or reporting, and we came up with this notion of the best obtainable version of the truth. And that's what this was about. That's what Bradley was about. That's what Katharine Graham was about. And that's what the reporting was about.
Okay, so we're going to talk about truth and reporting in a few minutes. Let's talk about danger. You thought your lives were in danger, okay? You attributed to good screenwriting from what Bradley had told you guys on his lawn. But reality, what's not screenwriting, is what's happening to journalists around the world. Journalists are on the front lines reporting what's happening, particularly in the Middle East. And some of them, sadly, tragically, are not coming home. That's reality. That's not screenwriting. Let's talk a little bit about that. That's today.
Well, those people are the real heroes who are in the Middle East covering the violence there. There was something in the New York Times this morning in which Obama said at some meetings he had before his speech, saying that we are going to destroy ISIS and effectively go to war against them, where at these meetings with journalists that were off the record and a dinner he had with a bunch of national security experts, he said, I was quite astounded by this.
It was reported, he said.
He was reported, and it's Peter Baker, who's a pretty good reporter, but that he said, well, the advice I would have to ISIS is don't behead these people, take them, put a sign on them that says, stay out of here, it's none of your business, and then turn them back to their countries. Now, if the president said that, it's an indication, as soon as a reporter is told, get out of here, it's none of your business, that is going to get the blood flowing. And I wonder, and we don't know the truth of it, but the job of the journalist is to be there. And there are always going to be journalists there when there is a war or when there is a crisis. And they need to be protected as much as they can. Clearly, the whole declaration of war against ISIS very much has to do with the beheading of those two reporters and the ugliness and the brutality of it.
Okay, so Carl, some have criticized a supposed bias in reporting on Israel in particular. Perspective on the current U.S. media reporting, particularly in the Middle East, again?
I think there's media bias in various institutions against all kinds of things. I think Fox News has media bias, forget about Israel, toward one part of the political spectrum. And I think MSNBC has media bias toward another part of the political spectrum. I think that the American Jewish community is much too quick sometimes to make this broad allegation about media bias. I think you have to look at individual instances, and they're there. I think you also have to look at the complexity of the story. I don't think that there's any question that it's true that Israel is held to a different standard. There's a reason it's held to a different standard, the same way the United States is held to a different standard, because of the kind of people and nation that we are and because of the kind of people and nation that Israel is. I think there is a terrible problem in journalism with reporters who don't know history. And that is true both about Israel and it's true about the Congress of the United States. So that I'm very wary to make this blanket assertion about media bias against Israel. And the other thing about that is that the people in this room know that Israel is a great democracy and a divided country politically, very much like we're a divided country politically, and particularly on questions that have to do, for instance, with settlements, that have to do, to mistake the Likud government, to confuse the idea that the Likud government is necessarily Israel, seems to me is a fundamental problem that all kinds of American journalists do. That said, nonetheless, I think that the nature of news is such that the larger, more powerful, armed country, Israel, is going to sometimes be unfairly regarded in the news without enough thoughtfulness about the threat to Israel. But I think in this last go-round, the threat to Israel was made very, very clear in most of the national reporting that I saw on television, in print, the threat from the tunnels, the threat from those rockets. So you see where I'm going here. Yes, but no.
Wow, he's going to run for office. but the remedy is in-depth reporting, and there is not enough of it. Let's not kid ourselves. We live in this internet culture it's driven by impatience in speed, in simplification, often gross or significant distortion. And when I'm sorry to go back to this, when we were working on Watergate back in the early 70s, we wrote our stories on things called typewriters. Anyone remember what those are? And we could work 2 or 3 weeks on a story, and the editors would look at drafts. And now, if it looks like you have a significant or even an insignificant advance on a running story, somebody's in your office saying, can we get it on the internet by noon? And so the quality and depth is diluted in a way that often distorts. And I think a lot of people, I've done 2 books on Obama. When you really get into the details matter. And on issues like this, often people don't have that luxury of time to really dig into it.
So last week, I got on my device 2 retractions from 2 news organizations that had retracted a prior news piece to update it with the correct facts. They obviously were concerned in getting there first. Immediacy is taking precedent over accuracy. Pretty accurate?
Much too much. Much too much. But I think we ought to talk about another aspect of, look, we have real problems in terms of our profession and how we're getting and delivering the news and the commitment of not enough news organizations to the kind of reporting we're describing and talking about here. But there's a concomitant problem, and it goes to the question of history as well. And that is people who consume, quote, media and news. Because unlike at the time of Watergate, and there's no way to quantify this, fewer and fewer people are interested in the best obtainable version of the truth in this country. Too many people are interested in media reports as ammunition to buttress their already held political and ideological and religious beliefs. that we're not looking enough for the best obtainable version of the truth as consumers of news. So I think we're too quick sometimes. Look at the culture. Same with Washington. Look, Washington, the Congress of the United States is a disgrace. We all know that. But it's also a reflection of the country at large in terms of the idiocy of the political debate very often. In terms of the lack of knowledge of history that I sat next to, I'll tell you who it was, Rick Santorum one night at a dinner, and it was we were all at a dinner to promote civics and history education in the schools. And on the table was the citizenship test that people take. And I said to Rick Santorum, Senator, how many people in the Congress of the United States do you think could pass the citizenship test? I don't know, maybe 50? Well, what does that mean? How many people who read newspapers could pass it? This is a complex cultural problem, and we need to take it outside of just journalism, is my point.
So, Bob, should we be concerned about the news we read?
Yeah, really have to be concerned about the news media. And part of the problem is that we forget what we already know or what is documented. And because this is, I mean, what's going on with the Obama administration and ISIS is a really, really important issue. And in the book I did, Obama's Wars, on the Afghan operation, after Obama was elected first, 2008, before he became president, he had a series of briefings with the CIA. And the CIA director at the time was Michael Hayden, a retired four-star Air Force general. And the discussion of drone strikes, using drones to kill terrorists, came up. And Michael Hayden said to Rahm Emanuel, then the White House chief of staff, or about to be, and to the others in the Obama administration, look, we've got these drones can be very effective, but you can't change conditions on the ground just from the air. And we know that from World War II, from Vietnam. And the second thing is you can't do it forever. And we now, in the ISIS war, have embraced the strategy of the United States is going to provide air support and will bomb and so forth, and the ground troops are going to be supplied by moderate Syrian rebels. I think there are 4 left. And, you know, the Saudis and other countries there, and because I've spent too much time on this, I know these people, these generals who were in the Pentagon or had command or are there now, and the White House Chief of Staff acknowledged this on television this morning, that there's not a single one of them, not a single one of them who said this is a sound strategy. And so Obama was warned in 2008. We have the reality now that the military, you know, presidents are not military strategists. They're supposed to go to the military and say, this is what we want you to do. You tell me what the options are on how to do it. And he's come up with a strategy that the military is not going to buy. Second, real quick point is the issue of do you go to Congress? And Carl rightly criticizes Congress. But if you look at the Constitution on the war-making issues, it is a shared power between the President and the Congress, and you just can't ignore that shared power. I remember once during the Bush administration meeting with a bunch of academics, and they said, oh, the Constitution says Congress will declare war. And I said, but that's not the reality. The President's the commander-in-chief. He can employ the force as he sees fit. Congress could cut off money, and they wouldn't hear of this. And I finally said, look, George Bush can invade Mexico tomorrow. And somebody stood up in the back and said, don't give him any ideas. But, you know, we're getting the Constitution and the history. It is a shared power. The limitations on just using air power is quite significant. The role of the military has been written about extensively, and you know, we're entering into an era which is going to challenge not just Obama and others, it's going to challenge the press. We have got to find out what's going on. We've got to see what the criticisms are or what the rationale.
Is there a real debate going on within the White House about this strategy? How did we get to this place? It is a real reversal. Well, what are the steps? Who was involved? How did we get here?
We're going to talk about the presidency. And what you just described, Bob, was both of you gave fascinating interviews with the Cleveland Jewish News staff reporter Carla Wolf, very gracious. The last 2 weeks, they're on the front page of our newspaper. Bob, you particularly expressed concern in the centralization of power in the presidency. Obviously, you know, you've talked about it. It's clearly an extension of, I'm assuming it's an extension of your book from Obama War that you described?
Yeah.
That's it.
It is.
Yeah, it is, but you've got to understand, I mean, one of the things when you do a book like this and have the time, I was able to get the national security notes and interviewed just about everyone involved. Interviewed Obama. How did you make these decisions on the Afghan war? And I sent him a list of questions, and they say, fine, Saturday morning, go interview him. And it's not just the question of what did you do here, or why did you do it, or who did you listen to. The question ultimately is, and just this week I was talking to Ken Burns, who's done this documentary on the Roosevelts, which apparently is quite fabulous. And what Burns was saying, when you do one of these documentaries, there's one question you want to answer. Who was this person? Complete, total universe portrait of them. When you do a book on Obama and war, you can't answer, you know, who is he? But you can say, what does he really think about war? And at the end, it was a cold shower, quite frankly. I handed him a quote from a World War II book about war, Rick Atkinson's book, Day of Battle, one of the great World War II books. And Atkinson, who was a colleague at the Washington Post for a long time, just steps back and says, what is war? And he said, you know, war corrupts everyone. You are killing people, and no person, from the commander-in-chief to the lowest private, leaves war with their heart unstained. And I hand this to Obama, and it's a Saturday morning, and he's dressed. He was going out to play golf, so I was keeping him from the first tee. And I said, well, you know, what do you think of this? And he said, I'm sympathetic with this. Go read my Nobel Prize acceptance speech. Now, I'd seen it. I'd read it. Ever seen something and read something and not understood it? Happens to me too often. So I take this assignment, I go back home, get out the Nobel Prize speech, and read it in the context in which he said, you ought to read this, and there it is. He hates war. He said, war is sometimes necessary, but he said, it's never glorious. You may recall Winston Churchill said war is glorious. In fact, Churchill at one point said war is delicious, if you can imagine that. And then Obama goes on to say, yeah, war, even though it's necessary at times, it is always a manifestation and expression of human folly. And he is right. It's often human folly on the other side. And I came away, I said, he does not like war. His mandate is to stop war and get out of war, avoid war. And now, I mean, please, sure. You know, let's all tune in. He has said, we're going to war. And there are people in the White House are trying to say, oh, this isn't a war. I mean, sit on the end of that bomb that lands on your house and tell somebody that's not war.
Right. All right, we're going to go back to the screen. Bob, I'm going to ask you to turn your head slightly so you can see the screen.
We know that picture.
Yeah, you know the picture. You can probably see it over my shoulder. It's been 40 years and 1 month ago that the 37th President of the United States of America resigned his office. Take us to that day. What was going through each of your minds? Carl, kick it off.
The awe, absolute awe that this thing that had begun with this burglary had come to this. But awe above all, I think, that the system had worked, as perhaps it never had or has since. Which is to say, yeah, the press did its job, and obviously we were aware of the role of the Washington Post and our role, but also that by a vote of 77 to nothing, the Senate of the United States, a unanimous vote, had undertaken an investigation into the President of the United States campaign activities. Can you imagine today a 77 to nothing vote in the Senate about anything? That there had been a great judge who had read stories in the paper and had used his courtroom,
Judge
Sirica, to pry out of the Watergate burglars a confession that yes, they were being paid for their silence in a cover-up from the White House. And then the Supreme Court of the United States, by a unanimous vote, told the President of the United States he was not above the law and had to turn over his tapes that he refused to turn over to the special prosecutor. And that committees of Congress, led by Republican votes, courageous Republican votes in the House of Representatives, had voted articles of impeachment against the President of the United States. And that Republicans, led by Senator Barry Goldwater, the great conservative from Arizona, had gone to the White House when Nixon wouldn't resign and said, Mr. President, you have to go. So the system had worked.
And he did it in an interesting way, because Goldwater and the other Republicans went down to meet with Nixon the night before, or 2 days before, and Nixon kind of jokingly said, well, you know, I'm going to be impeached. The House is going to force a Senate trial. Barry, how many votes do you think I have in the Senate? 20? And Goldwater said 4, Mr. President, and it doesn't include mine. And we found out about that because Goldwater had us to his apartment one night and gave us his personal diary. Now, real quickly on your question, that day with Nixon, right before he'd given a speech, the farewell speech, which was televised live, and he was sweating and really kind of unscripted and complaining about how his mother and father had been treated, and read from Teddy Roosevelt's diary about the light went out of my life forever when his wife died, equating almost the loss of the presidency with the loss of a spouse. But then, and this is the paradox of Nixon, he at the end kind of waved his hand, as if this is why I called you all here. And he said precisely the following: always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself. Now think of the wisdom in that statement. He realized that it was the hate, was the poison, was the piston of his administration. That's what's demonstrated on the tapes. And, you know, he couldn't kind of say, well, I now got what did me in, so I'm going to stay. He resigned, but you listen to enough of those tapes and read the transcripts, and the hate for the opposition, the hate for the rule of law, the hate for, as Carl's often said, for any group, and I mean the anti-Semitic comments on the tapes but he talked that way about everyone. He was a president who lived his office in a kind of rage about, and here, Carl, you made this point early on, this man had won re-election in 1972. He'd been elected first in 68, and he had no perception of the goodwill that was directed at him, not just by Republicans, but by Democrats. Democrats wanted him to succeed because if the president succeeds, the country succeeds. And all he wanted to do is turn the power of the government, use the FBI, the CIA, the Secret Service, the IRS to convert those
enemies.
To instruments of personal revenge.
Okay,
How
this is
sad.
this is all fascinating, and I have a few follow-ups quickly that I want to get through because the audience, we promised the audience that they would have a chance to ask you questions, and I want to deliver on my promise. So, real quick follow-ups. One, you guys never met Nixon, correct?
No.
Never met him. Never interviewed him, obviously.
No.
We were not on his Christmas card list either.
Yeah. Okay, make them quick, please, guys, because I want to get to these.
Yeah.
One question, Carl, that you would ask Nixon, would have asked him, what would it have been?
Why?
Bob?
Same question. Why?
Okay, you talked about the tapes. Nixon asked Haldeman, his chief of staff, several times to destroy the tapes. He had secret recording devices planted not only in his Oval Office, had them in the cabinet room, had them at Camp David. He asked him to destroy them several times. Why do you think, guys, and I'll start with you, Bob, didn't Haldeman destroy the tapes?
There's some evidence he thought he could write the perfect memoir. You go to the Nixon Library in California, and they have a little doll's house mock-up of the Oval Office, and it says, push this button and a red light will go on everywhere where there was a microphone in the Oval Office. So you kind of push it, and the Oval Office lights up like a Christmas tree. There were 5 microphones on the desk. There were microphones in the chandeliers of the Oval Office. When I went to see Obama once there, I brought 2 tape recorders because I didn't want equipment malfunction, and his press secretary said, oh yeah, the tapes, and then Obama kind of points at the chandeliers and said, I better get somebody to check and make sure they're not still there.
Carl, why? Same feeling about why Haldeman.
Well, there's real evidence.
The president, his boss, tells him to destroy
that
them.
the purpose of the tapes, there's real evidence that he thought that he would write the great presidential memoir by having recall of everything that he had done in office, and it would make his heroism apparent. And then, not only once Watergate occurred, because the tape recordings were secret, that then he could use them selectively as evidence to find himself somehow exonerated by selective use of what was on the tapes.
Okay. All right, we're going to get to the audience questions. Bob, you went down this road. I'm going to continue because the audience wants to know. You talked about anti-Semitism, particularly with Nixon. What is your barometer, the level of anti-Semitism in the U.S. and the world today?
It's clearly a problem, and again, it is just so it's so far from my experience and worldview. I quite frankly don't understand it. It's one of the baffling things.
Well, it's more than in this country. It seems to me we've overcome anti-Semitism to a degree that is absolutely remarkable. But the fact remains that Israel has been the red herring for X number of years about the grievances of Muslims. And that, yes, there are all kinds of valid arguments about a Palestinian state that the Palestinians might have, but the idea that if you look at the virulent, insane. It's not, but it's now not just anti-Semitism. It has been joined in this murderous, barbaric jihad. So we have to talk about that. And then we also have to talk about European anti-Semitism, which there's no question has increased in disturbing ways.
And
I just want to go one other place. And then there is the debate you hear within Israel itself is, well, has some of Israel's actions been self-defeating in terms of not justifying anti-Semitism, because there's no justification for anti-Semitism whatsoever, but has some of tactically, has some of what Israel has done worked against Israel's own interests?
But here's one of the themes on all of this, and it's the Nixon tapes and the anti-Semitic remarks by Nixon in front of Henry Kissinger. And the idea that Kissinger just does not have the courage.
Not once.
And I think it would have increased his stature, at least with himself, said, Mr. President, please don't talk that way, particularly around me. But there is total...
A refugee from Nazi Germany.
Yeah, yeah. And to not react to that because somehow you're letting Nixon talk that way. I mean, if somebody talked that way for one sentence or word around me, I don't care who it was, I would say, please don't talk like that. The silence of Henry Kissinger tells you the power Nixon had over people and the implied threat of exile if you ever challenged him.
Okay. So we know newsrooms have changed dramatically since the 1970s. Today, newsrooms are quite different. News stories that we're reporting on are quite different. Right now, look at the Ray Rice scandal. Call it the story. It is a troubling, concerning story, obviously. Every news organization that reports on that story is sourcing a news organization called TMZ. So I'm sure you guys have thoughts on that compared to how journalists are doing their job, the things we're reporting on compared to taking down the presidency of the United States.
What's the most important thing that a reporter or a journalistic organization does? Decide what is news. And that's the answer to your question. And that's about the values of an organization. We've always had gossip, we've always had sensationalism, we've always had a yellow press. And incidentally, that story is a real story. And it's a big story, and it ought to be a big story. But when a cable network, in fact, this cable network's on the same night as Obama's speech, led some of their broadcasts with that on a couple of the broadcasts later that night, or gave it equal billing at the top rather than Obama, then that tells you something about where we have gone with news values. So that would be my answer.
Okay, so not only are newsrooms changing, obviously the means in which we're journalists are...
Let me add something to that. I wrote a cover story for the New Republic in, I don't know, 15 years after Watergate, whatever that comes out to be, called The Triumph of Idiot Culture. And it was really about the Murdoch press to some extent, back then in 1990 or whenever it was. But we cannot divorce journalism from the rest of the culture. There is this hunger out there for crap, and we're feeding it. So let's not get too high and mighty about our sins without looking at this cultural phenomenon. It's about us as a whole.
Some would say that one of the contributors to that is Twitter, Facebook. The audience wants to know, if you had Twitter and Facebook, how would that have changed your coverage of Watergate?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think either of us does Facebook or Twitter. I mean,
we call our children.
And, you know, when somebody said to me, "Did you tweet me?" I thought they'd been assaulted. So, but that, you know, we have the luxury of being old men who can remove ourselves from that. I went in to see a couple of months ago in our daughter's room, and she's 18, and she had her laptop open, her iPad open, and her iPhone open, all three screens. And I said, Diana, and I had a question, and she looked at me and snapped and said, "Can't you see I'm focused?" Good luck, Dad. I'm going to write a column called "The Fourth Screen." Me. And it is a diminishing screen.
Okay, so talking about diminishing, the audience wants to know, with cutbacks at the Plain Dealer, our daily newspaper, and other papers, investigative journalism is in danger of going out of business. Where do you see any possibilities of investigative reporting being able to function freely and unfiltered?
I think there's great investigative journalism going on. Let's take a look at the pedophile priest stories that the Boston Globe did. Take a look online. There's plenty of great reporting going on. The question is more, is it going to be supported by readers and viewers? Are there institutions that are powerful enough that they will draw audiences and influence to it? Is NBC News doing investigative reporting? You know, this huge enterprise. No. Is CBS? Well, yes, there's 60 Minutes. Is ABC? Well, they have one, quote, investigative reporter. No, this is not a priority even for the biggest institutions. Yes, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, a few other organizations, some great online investigative journalism, new things like ProPublica. Great reporting going on. Is the story getting through? Are people interested in it? But you talk about local newspapers. We had in this country, and incidentally, the internet did not kill great local journalism. It started before the internet when companies like Gannett came in and started buying up papers all over America and buying the opposition paper, closing one down, stripping newsrooms so that the staffs left. There was no investigative reporting. In papers all over America with circulation of 100,000, 200,000, it disappeared before the internet. Now, I don't want to generalize too much, but that's the environment. And we also need to look at the seriousness of ourselves as a culture and whether we're open to it. But we also, look, Woodward has a great line that he once said, and that is that all great reporting is done in defiance of management. Well,
you don't subscribe to that.
So I was going to ask you what...
Well, let me tell you what it means. It means that, yes, you're right to say to your 5 reporters, I want a story on what the rabbinical board did this week. I want a story on sports and what our team did and all the rest. And your reporter then has to, after he gives you those stories, he has to go out on his own and find some real news on his own that is not about what you want, because he knows better and is in a better place to get it, or she, than you are.
Absolutely. So I was going to ask...
And the defiance is not breaking the law or the rules. It's kind of saying, hey, those people in the offices don't know what's going on.
That's our job.
I've heard the following. I want to check. I want to work on that. And there is a tension, right?
Yeah.
And that you have to, kind of like in judo, use that leverage to get the reporters to dig into things and find out what's going on in the community.
So I was going to ask you guys what should keep me up at night as a publisher of a thriving community newspaper. I think you just told me. You just answered my question, because that scares the heck out of me, but you're right. So, all right, here we're going to lighten it up a little bit. Why not alphabetical? I love how you call them Woodward. I think it's awesome. And when I introduced you both on stage, I said Woodward and Bernstein. What was the reason behind Woodward and Bernstein? I was just wondering, somebody from the audience.
It's funny. If all the president's been. Bernstein is first. On the final days, Woodward is first. But what we evolved in the newsroom was, on the bylines on the story, whoever had done the primary reporting on that story would get the byline first. And they probably evened out, is my guess. But also, there's just a whole rhythmic thing. Bernstein and Woodward.
Well, it makes for Woodstein.
Woodstein.
I mean,
Bradley called you guys Woodstein,
Bernward
right?
is not very
Bernward
good.
don't work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
All right, 2 book questions, one for each of you on 2 different cards. Bob, what's the main lesson of your book, Price of Politics?
well, that it's screwed up. This is about the budget making between Obama and the Republicans, particularly in Congress. The chief lesson is that he has not won the Democrats over, in addition to not winning the Republicans over. And I would blame both Obama and particularly the Republicans. John Boehner goes down there, and I have the notes, and I have them confirmed. Essentially blackmails the president, says on the debt ceiling, the issue of whether we're going to extend the borrowing authority of the U.S. Treasury, which if it was not extended, we would have an economic meltdown, not just in this country, but in the world. It's absolutely vital. John Boehner goes in there and says, I'm going to use the leverage on that to extract out of you things I would not normally get. Now, you know, that's blackmail. Yeah. That's extortion. And Boehner shouldn't talk that way, and Obama shouldn't let him talk to him that way. He should say, John, you know, everyone else out of the room, please, I'm a lawyer, and you can't come into the Oval Office and say, I'm going to extract things out of you. That's what these people who hold hostages, I'm going to extract something out of you. At the same time, Obama is the CEO of the country. He has, and my conclusion simply is that he has not found 2 presidents very different who you can criticize, and I would on many fronts, Reagan and Clinton. Reagan and Clinton found a way in the end to work their will. Obama has not. And he has hurt his cause, the things he believes in. One of his aides told me, he said, Obama has the armor of a good heart. And I think that's true. I think he cares about all of these things very sincerely. He hasn't mastered the art of human relations, 101, to make friends and spend time with these people, but not just Republicans, Democrats. You talk to Democrats, I first heard this from Carl. I mean, they are beside themselves.
Second and third year of the presidency, Democrats all over town would say to me, I've never talked to the guy. He doesn't call. He doesn't call us down to the White House. Bob tells a story about when he finally did get together one night. He took a bunch of legislators to dinner at the Jefferson Hotel. Well, the greatest tool that a president of the United States, I don't know how many of you have been to the White House, you walk into the White House and you got all those pictures on the wall, and it doesn't matter how many times you've been there, you get a lump in your tummy. And you sit under the portrait of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and the President of the United States is talking to you, it's going to have a different result than being in the dining room at a Jefferson Hotel.
And I kept asking, was the chef off that night or something like that? I mean, imagine
what is that about?
You're an important senator, and you say to your wife, dear, I'm going to have dinner with the President of the United States tonight at the Jefferson Hotel. I mean, the 10 year, and I got to know Obama enough. I mean, he believes in these things. He wants to do things. He is a reformer. He said in his second inaugural, very important line, which has received too little attention. He said, our creed is that the little girl born in the bleakest poverty in America will have the same chance as everyone else. That's 100 years away when the little girl born in the bleakest poverty is going to have the same chance as our children. I think he really believes that, and I think he's working toward that, but execution is the problem, and you have to have friends, even when you're president.
I'm going to ask a couple more questions from the audience. We talked about ownership, newspaper ownership in particular, the support that you got from Katharine Graham as publisher and owner of the Post. What direction do you think Jeff Bezos of the world's largest shopping center, Amazon.com, will take the Washington Post now that he has acquired the paper?
I think he's really, and we know a little bit about this, had some contact with him, Bob a little more than I actually, but he's very serious about a newspaper or a news organization that has a global reach and readership, that seriously covers big stories and at the same time uses the web as a platform that can generate business and generate readers coming to all kinds of interesting and galvanizing things for readers. But underneath it all, the history of the Washington Post as a great repertorial organization, particularly driven by great and big stories.
Yes.
Sound right to you?
I think that in Bezos's idea, he spent $250 million to buy the Post. 1% of his net worth, it might be the way some people buy a sailboat or put a new deck on their house. But he's serious. I've known him for years. He wants, look, simple reality, in 10 years, 20 years, there are only going to be a handful of news organizations that provide information. His goal is that the Washington Post be one of those major news and information and idea centers. And he's putting money where his mouth is and growing the staff, and I'm quite optimistic about it. And we have, I mean, this is kind of a newspaper, not well known, but there are 20 projects underway, investigative projects or serious examinations of international, national, and local problems. And so, you know, that's expensive, that doesn't pay off, and he realizes, I mean, he came to the Post and talked to the whole staff, and he said, you know, you have a good story, investigative story, and then somebody, one of the blogs or the news services or AP picks it up, and, you know, they take the wind out of your sails, and nobody is going to say, oh, gee, I'll go subscribe to the Washington Post to read the 10,000-word version of that story or series of stories when I can get, you know, a compressed version from the Associated Press. So we're in a difficult period of attention span. I mean, what is the attention span of the average public? And I think we have to find, Carl and I were talking at lunch, how do you slow your own life down so you're not continually on the devices, and so you are kind of actually reading a book? How about that for a novel idea?
Carl, no pun intended. Carl, Edward Snowden, traitor or patriot?
Say that once. Oh, Snowden.
Edward Snowden.
Traitor or patriot? Neither. We don't know all his motivations. What he has done that is really constructive is to have a real debate about the nature of our intelligence gathering and in this country. I think there's been entirely too much surprise as, oh my God, the NSA is a vacuum cleaner? We've known this since Maltz worked at NSA in 1953, actually, and it was a Hoover then. It was a little vacuum cleaner. Now it's a huge vacuum cleaner. But what is important that Snowden has produced is that it is a system of intelligence gathering that is capable of being abused. Imagine if a Nixon had access to all of this information. We are learning that the oversight that is intended to be in place in the Congress of the United States and in this so-called judiciary special court setup that's supposedly looking over what the NSA does, it doesn't work. And we need safeguards. But look, terrorism is real. And the threat is real. And the basic intelligence gathering tool, you got human intelligence and signals, electronic intelligence. And that's how you do crime and forensics, and you obtain information this way, and we have to do it to protect ourselves. At the same time, there have got to be proper restraints, but oversight above all else. Not
How much more time do we have?
How much more time can you guys tell me?
No, because you haven't asked about Hillary Clinton.
Do you remember the remark I said earlier about I'm trying to avoid the politics questions because we're nonpartisan, but you want to talk about Hillary Clinton?
Well, Carl wrote a book, it came out in 2007, 2008, A Woman in Charge, which is really the definitive biography of her. And what's amazing is the reporting. You learn about, well, you talk briefly about it, and then I want to tell a Hillary story.
The thing about Hillary Clinton is that, once again, it's about reporting. Nobody seemed to have learned about her early life. They took her version of events of this idyllic childhood. She had an abusive father who was a misanthrope. If you read this book, you begin to see this environment that she grew up in that helps to explain her later life. And you also see how she enabled Bill Clinton in certain ways. You know, she has saved Bill Clinton and his presidency and his governorship a dozen times now. But she is fascinating. She is at her best when she's being herself, and at her worst when she very often is not being herself and trying to be somebody else. What you learn about her is a vulnerable figure, and at the same time someone who has now been in public life for more than 30, 35 years, and there is a real question throughout her public life about her candor. And that's still a big question about her. Whether it's a big question about most and too many politicians. But the question of her really being open and transparent, back to what we just saw in the rollout of the book. Oh, we were broke. We were? I don't know. Let's go from there.
Yeah. It's a balanced account, though. You read that book as I have.
She's a remarkable woman.
And you see, she did the turn as Secretary of State, and you can criticize it or praise it.
Pretty great Secretary of State as an ambassador for the country. Obama shut her out.
All right, I'm going to wrap it up because we're going a little bit over with one more.
I want to tell, because who Hillary Clinton is important to the and this isn't partisan.
You're good.
It was, I think, 2005, 2006 in Washington. I was giving a talk, and she was the other speaker. It was before a group of bankers. And afterwards, we said hello to each other, and she said, "Oh, I quote from one of your Bush books so often, I think I should give you royalties." I stupidly said no rather than how much. And I said, "What is it you quote from?" She said, "Well, it's the end of the Plan of Attack book about how Bush decided to invade Iraq." And she said, "It's the last couple of lines of the book." And in the last couple of lines of the book, when I'd gone through the excavation of all the notes, interviewed Bush for 3 hours, kind of, not just how did you feel about Saddam Hussein, but this happened on the 3rd of March, and Cheney said this, and Powell said that, and so forth. So a long series of interviews, and he's standing in the Oval Office with his hands in his pockets. And I just asked, how do you think history will judge your Iraq war? And he takes his hands out of his pockets and he throws them in the air with the kind of George Bush, you know, like only he can. And he said, history. I think the question about history caused him to think about all those history exams at Yale he didn't do that well on. And, but he said, literally, he said, history, we won't know, we'll all be dead. Comforting thought. And when I went home, my wife asked, you know, how are the interviews? And I said, you know, I think he answered all the questions, but the really good news is I have the ending to the book. Endings are hard to find. But then Hillary Clinton's, I said, well, why do you quote that? And now she's a senator from New York at this point, gearing up to run for president. And she said, well, I quote that because you can't think and talk like that and be president of the United States. George Bush is a fatalist. You do what you think is right, and then you leave it to others to assess and judge. And I pushed back a little and said Lincoln was a little bit of a fatalist. She really got, this is the Hillary you don't see. She got steamy, kind of lamp-throwing intense, and started pounding her hand, her fist in her hand, and said, look, I'm telling you, you can't think and talk like that and be president of the United States. I think I pushed back a little bit and said, look, George Washington would never, ever talk like that. Thomas Jefferson would never, ever talk like that. Bill himself would never talk like that. And I remember thinking, the new Mount Rushmore. Washington, Jefferson, and they tear Teddy Roosevelt down, and they put Bill in there, and maybe Hillary. And I was going to say something, but then I thought, we won't know. We'll all be dead.
Beautiful.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to bring this full circle. You guys are great storytellers. You made my job real easy. 900 plus members of this thriving Jewish community of Northeast Ohio came together tonight to celebrate 50 years of the Cleveland Jewish News, one of the few remaining independent Jewish community newspapers to exist. You heard the president of our board of, I presumably heard the president of our board of directors get up here on the stage and tell this audience that the weekly newspaper that they read every Friday isn't going away. Give us, Bob, you commented about, you know, with Bezos's ownership of the Post, and there's going to be 5-10 years from now, there's going to be a handful of owners of newspapers. Give us some glimmer of hope about the role that we play, more than a glimmer. Give us, and Carl, I know you're a big fan because you've mentioned this privately before, about our Jewish newspaper, what it means to the community, the importance, relevance to what we do and carry out.
Well, I'll let Woodward talk about weekly community papers because he worked for one, and that's how he got to the Washington Post. And it's a very important lesson. And I'll talk about the fact that I come from a tradition where my Uncle Itzel was for 50 years the circulation and exchange manager of the Jewish Daily Forward in Baltimore and Washington. And I grew up, what all my relatives reading the Forward's in Yiddish. And I remember the Jewish Telegraphic Agency and a great Washington reporter named Milt Friedman. Does that name mean anything to anybody here?
Hands go up.
So that, look, communities, Jewish communities, Christian communities, communities organized around geography need their news. And big news institutions that are concerned about global events can't get there. And it's a great thing, particularly in a Jewish community. You got, what, 80,000 people in the Jewish community
80,000
here?
in the Jewish community.
80,000 here. You know, that is as many, there are small towns with that many people that have newspapers. So it's a great function, and you do real reporting. I read the whole thing today. I'm going to ask you about a letter to the editor in there that Woodward said, don't bring it up. I'm going to ask you about it later.
I can only imagine which one it was.
You know which one
and
it is.
I guarantee you we had a discussion about it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
But go tell them about the Montgomery County Sentinel.
No, well, I mean, it's the Montgomery County Sentinel, a weekly paper owned by Doc Kaploff, and he was a dentist, and you come into the office, and if you wanted to give news to somebody or buy an ad, you went to the right. If you wanted to get your dentures fixed, you went to the left. This was real community living, and my only thought about your newspaper is, in the end, it's about the First Amendment. And there's one thing one concept I think that we all share, and that is it is a sacred trust to be held as close and to make sure that it is permanent and independent and probing, and you're going to read things in it that you disagree with, but that's the glory of the First Amendment.
It is indeed the community's newspaper. Ladies and gentlemen, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward.
Thank you. Good.
That was fun.
Thanks.
That was
Thank
great.
you.
Enjoyed it.
Thanks. Okay. Good. Where do we go?
You've been a very gracious audience
way.
tonight.
What?
Thank you for allowing us to go over a little bit. My staff knows I have a hard time with deadlines and keeping everyone on task. Bring your tribute books home. Log on to our Facebook page. Tag yourself in photos. It'll all be posted within the next 24 hours. Drive safely. Thank you all very much, and have a great evening.
How are you? Good to see you. Thank you for the note.